Today we're going to talk about attachment patterns and the way they affect the reaction to loss of a loved person. My name is Colin Parks. I'm a psychiatrist and I've been working with bereaved people and organisations for bereavement for many, many years. Let's look at the first slide. In this series of lectures on attachment and loss, we're going to start by talking about attachment patterns and the way in which those influence the reaction to the lost person. In the course of the 3 lectures, I shall start off by talking about the influence of individual person-to-person attachments. We'll be talking about the dual process model and other things to do with the way in which people love each other. The nature of all of this is about the nature of love, and by love, by attachment, I mean the way in which people become attached. We'll go on to talk about the attachments within families and move from that to small groups, communities, that kind of attachment, and finally looking at large groups. And at that point we'll be talking too about disasters and major incidents. So just to start off then with the individual, perhaps the most important contribution to our understanding of attachments comes from the dual process model. Group at the University of Utrecht, particularly Margaret Ströber and Henk Schut, pointed out the way in which, following the loss or separation of any loved person, we experience 2 different kinds of psychological process. On the one hand, there is what they call the loss orientation, intense feelings of pining and yearning for the person who's gone. And this is the sine qua non of love. It's what defines love. When most people talk about love, it's this attachment, it's the pangs that occur when we're separated from people that they're talking about. In fact, you could say in a way that the best way of finding out what you love is to find out what you miss when it's not there. In other words, love and loss and the grief that goes with it are the most characteristic evidence of love. The second process, though, that occurs following the loss or separation from loved people is the need to find out what you've lost and find out where you're going. It's more to do with the restoration of not necessarily forgetting the past, but drawing on it and finding out how what you've lost remains relevant in the life that you're now leading. And so these 2, the loss orientation is very much looking back, and this is what most people mean when they talk about grief, the pining and yearning for the lost person. The restoration orientation is what happens in between the pangs of grief when we have to go